welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, everybody. This is Barney Levantino. Welcome to Turn the Page, the podcast of Syosset Library. My guest today is author Michael Benson. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Barney. Pleasure being here.
I'm glad to have you. We this week we had to reschedule a couple of times, but we're looking forward to having a little chit chat today. And Michael's book is it's an interesting one. The title, when I first saw it, it almost sounded like a bad movie title, but it's legit, and it is
or a good movie title.
Good movie title. There we go.
Yeah.
But the content is good. This book is Gangsters VS Nazis, and it's a story that a lot of people are not familiar with, I'm sure. Michael, how did you come to the story, and just give us a brief overview of what the book's about?
Well, I first heard about the battle between Depression-era gangsters and the rising American Nazi movement by studying for my book, Who's Who in the JFK Assassination. And during that time, I read 26 volumes of Warren Commission testimony exhibits twice. And in there, Jack Ruby and his relatives, Jack Ruby being the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, tried to convince his interviewers, who happened to be Gerald Ford, a future president, and Earl Warren, of the Supreme Court Justice, that he was actually a good guy, because back in the olden days, he was one of those guys in Chicago who busted up the German-American Bund meetings when they were spreading anti-Semitism. And this turned out to be true. I did not know that this was an organized effort that went from coast to coast in 1938, until I was informed of the fact by my literary agent, Doug Grad, during 18 holes of golf here in Brooklyn. And I immediately knew that it was a story that needed to be told.
You know, it's funny. I've been talking to a number of authors lately, and a theme that has run through, and it's whether I'm speaking to fiction writers or nonfiction writers, the question of plausibility of the stories. And I've talked to a couple of authors of first-time fiction thrillers, and as a reader of a thriller, I'm always suspicious, and I'm disappointed when the plot lines just become so improbable as to lose any sense of reality. And the same holds true. I've spoken to a couple of authors lately of nonfiction works where the subject matter on its face just seems like just such a crazy notion. And as I'm reading this book and I'm learning about what transpired, it's just a fascinating story.
Well, I think it's one of the few stories I've ever encountered in which the heroes are the only ones who break the law. The bad guys break no laws. It's in the twilight zone between what's legal and what's just, I suppose. It has gangsters who are, this close to being on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, working hand in hand with the U.S. judicial system in order to rid America of a menace that is particularly troubling to Jewish Americans. So yeah, in terms of plausibility, no, you would never believe it in a million years. I compared at the very beginning of the book to issue number 1 of Captain America comics, where we have heroic Americans punching out Nazis for the sake of just telling them to shut up, stop saying bad things about Jewish people. So yeah, I mean, the only part I still find implausible is that Bugsy Siegel used his hands on Nazis, because I'm pretty sure that he had a rule that he used his hands only on women and he shot men. But according to Mickey Cohen, his good friend, when it came time to punch a Nazi in the nose, Benjamin Siegel was in.
It's almost like a public service announcement for the mob in terms of what they were doing. So how did it come about? What brought the mob into fighting the American. And actually, let's backtrack a little bit. Talk about what the state of the American Nazi Party was in the 1930s, where it was at, and what was going on.
Well, yeah, in the 1938, which is when most of the book takes place, America's been in the Great Depression for almost a decade. And nobody has any money. Seems like nobody's ever had any money. And it's very easy under those circumstances to spread conspiracy theories with scapegoats. And what certain German Americans were doing were they were scapegoating Jewish Americans, saying the reason we don't have any money is because they have it all. They're all communists and they've taken all the money and they've wrecked our economy. And that's what's wrong. If we get rid of the Jews, all of this will be fixed, which of course came to as a great shock to the rag man in the streets of Newark, New Jersey, whose horse just died in the middle of the street. I do not have all the money. I don't know what you're talking about. But it finally reached a head, and there was probably 100,000 supporters of Hitler in America in 1938. But it came, and what bothered Jewish American leaders the most was the brazen nature which they were demonstrating. They were having parades on East 86th Street in Manhattan that resembled the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, only instead of balloons, they had Sieg Heiling and swastika flags. Just shocking. And the last straw comes when they have a rally in the Bowling Green section of Manhattan, southern tip of Manhattan, at the same time as a U.S. Maritime Service ceremony that was going on the front steps of the U.S. Customs building, gorgeous building. And the good Americans had to move inside because the German Nazis refused to stop chanting and waving around their signs saying horrible things about Jewish people. And it was a standoff for a while, and eventually the good Americans gave in. And a witness to this was Judge Nathan Perlman of New York courts, who had a couple of drinks on the matter, thought it through, and the next day in his chambers, he called up Meyer Lansky, the all-time greatest #1 Jewish gangster, and said, Meyer, do you have anybody who might want to punch a Nazi? And Meyer said, yeah, I think I do. And that's how it starts.
The main character, I think the leader of the German American Bund, as they were calling themselves, Fritz Kuhn, kind of a
the Bundesführer.
Interesting character in himself. So talk a little bit about him, where he came from, and how he got to where he was and what he was.
Well, he was the leader of when Fritz Kuhn came on the scene. The organization, the biggest German American organization, was called the Friends of New Germany, and they were pretty much put down for being anti-American. So Fritz Kuhn takes this group and changes the name to the German American Bund. Now you can't say it's anti-American because it's got American right in its name. He was a guy with a protruding jaw, low brow, always grim in appearance. He looked like a general slaughtering his enemy, but alas, it needed to be done. And when he spoke in public, he would stick out his jaw and he'd become a picture of arrogance and defiance. When we first pick him up, he is working for Ford Motor Company, and still not a well-known fact, but Henry Ford was a major anti-Semite and a proponent of Adolf Hitler right up until Pearl Harbor, which of course changed everything. But Kuhn claims to have been with Hitler in the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, first time Hitler gets his name in the newspaper, and that he is in America as a disciple of Hitler's to gather up an army of like-minded people. And in the short term, they want to get German Americans to vote as a bloc to get right-wingers into political office. And in the long term, they want to make America into a carbon copy of Nazi Germany, where they could systemically get rid of groups they don't care for. And they would start with the Jews. Now, Fritz Kuhn was also a con artist. He frequently passed himself off as a physician, even though he was merely an X-ray technician. He was fired from the Ford Motor Company because he was doing his Hitler impression at the top of his lungs in a hospital dark room, and he was also bothering the ladies. Another problem of his. He had a wife, but he had a girlfriend in every town as well. So when he joins the Friends of New Germany, changes them into the German American Bund, and travels the country giving rousing speeches. He speaks of German American unity, and what German Americans need is a new organization with Hitler's agenda working in the U.S. And he compared Hitler's ideas to the founding fathers of America. And one of his tricks was he would always have a portrait of George Washington right next to Hitler's behind the stage, and there'd always be an American flag next to the swastika flag. And he was the leader. He also was not the world's most effective leader because he was such a loner. Apparently he had secrets. He always traveled by himself. He drank constantly. He always had schnapps before he gave a speech. Twice claimed he woke up in a car hanging off a bridge because he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. And even before Pearl Harbor, he's in trouble with the U.S. government, not because he's using hate speech, but because he's been embezzling from his own company. I guess it makes sense. So about 0.2% of German Americans were believers in Adolf Hitler's policies, which isn't a lot. It's 0.2 is 20 out of 1,000, something like that. So there's a lot of good German Americans, including my ancestors. I was pleased to find that when Kuhn came around to Rochester, New York, where I grew up, nobody showed up. And when I looked into it, it wasn't because word was already out that you might get punched if you go, but that Rochester had its own German American groups, and they were lovers, not haters. And I said, stay away from this guy, he's trouble. And Kuhn showed up and nobody else did. So he went to a Rochester bar and had a few drinks and tried Syracuse the next day.
So Judge Perlman gets involved in this and calls on Meyer Lansky and how does Lansky organize this, and how did they put it all together?
Well, both Perlman and Lansky understand that the guys who are going to combat the Nazis have to be Jewish because Gentiles just don't care. It's way too early, 1938. Most non-Jewish Americans feel they don't even have a dog in the fight in the European War, and Hitler's practically conquered all of Europe at that point, and he's got his eyes set on England. So it had to be Jewish men, had to be men who weren't too hesitant to hurt people, and it had to be men who weren't particularly worried about breaking the law. Because although Judge Perlman promised that he would have their back if they ever got arrested, and they never did, that you couldn't have somebody get cold feet in the middle of the fight. So he goes to a group known as Murder Inc. And Murder Inc. is a set of men set up outside the five-family system in New York who exist only to carry out hits. If someone in Genevieve's family wants to hit somebody in the Gambino family, there has to be a vote among all the bosses. And if they vote to make it so, phone call goes to Midnight Rose's back room in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and they tell him who the guy is. And within 48 hours, the guy has been shuffled off the mortal coil, usually pretty neatly and with no clues. So these guys are professional killers. And a lot of them came up the hard way. They fought in the streets and they knew how to handle themselves. But some of them were gun guys, like Bugsy Siegel out in LA. They were powerful men as long as they had their gat with them. So first thing Meyer Lansky does is he takes these guys to Gleason's gym, which at the time is in the Bronx. It's moved a couple of times. It's in Dumbo, Brooklyn now. And has Gleason give them some rudimentary boxing skills so that when they go in, they'll know what to do. So when the first riot in New York takes place at the Yorkville Casino, these smug Nazis were picking on Jews largely because they don't think there's ever going to be any blowback. Jewish people are soft. They're never going to be able to combat us. We're superior German Americans. And so the last thing they expect is to have these thugs come running in on them while they're talking about how soft and weak and inferior Jewish people are and bloodying their noses. And so there's a fun scene the next day because all of the men who are arrested were on the German side. and most of them had suffered injuries in the big brawl. So there was maybe 7 or 8 bandaged men in court the morning after the big fight, and a Jewish judge is behind the bench, and Jewish lawyers are defending these guys. And the judge says, you should really be glad that you're in America, because the very people that you want wiped out are going to send you home without putting you in jail today. And if, gentlemen, I suggest that if you think it through before you get together and say this stuff about Jewish people again. And the goal of the gangsters was to shut the Nazis up. It becomes analogous to war because war follows, in which some of these guys ended up being drafted and went and fought the Nazis marching across Europe with guns. But at the time, it wasn't thought of as that kind of a war. It was thought of as a way to deal with hate speech, because hate speech is still legal. And as long as the Nazis didn't scream fire in a crowded room or say something obscene, they could say whatever they wanted.
So it started in New York, and then this movement to shut down the Nazis kind of spread. And your book is broken up, not strictly chronologically, but in geographical settings. And one of the areas that you talk about is here, where I'm sitting here. Obviously, you're in Brooklyn. I'm on Long Island. Talk about Camp Siegfried, which was out here on Long Island. Yeah, and again, something that a lot of people are not aware of, but this was also was a program run by the Bund. And talk a little bit about these camps and Camp Siegfried in particular.
Well, during my research, there was absolutely nothing that upset me more than the notion of Nazi youth camps in America. The Nazi youth camps in Germany is upsetting, but to have them outside major cities across the country is just bizarre. And of course, history barely recognizes that any of this ever happened. Yaphank, Long Island, went Nazi. Their main street was changed the name to Hitlerstrasse, and a youth camp was set there, and they would recruit boys and girls from New York City with brochures that didn't mention Nazism. This is for German American boys and girls. They'll learn how to speak German better. They'll learn pride in their country. And they'll learn baseball and running and swimming and have a healthy time and breathe fresh air in the summertime, which is what you want because you live in grimy Brooklyn. And parents would send their kids, and the kids wouldn't find out until they got there that they were going to be indoctrinated into a paramilitary force. They were going to have to march and carry wooden guns and Sig Heil to swastikas. And on Sundays, they would give their parade for their proud parents who would come and watch, and politicians would show up and give speeches about how great it was that all these German Americans were here and with their clean faces breathing all this fresh air, and nary a hesitance that, gee, maybe it's not good to teach these kids that getting rid of Jews is the way to solve all of America's problems. It's just it's stunning to me. And it wasn't just Camp Siegfried. They had them in Jersey. They had them in the Catskills, within 2 woods and a 9-iron from the Borscht Belt, where middle class Jews would go for summertime fun. So there's a little bit of a extra insult there. Had them in L.A., had them in the Midwest, and right up until the moment that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, there's really not much controversy here.
It's we're talking about discussing Camp Siegfried out in the Yaphank area, and actually until after the war, the area where the camp was became residential, and up until very, very recently, there were still restrictive covenants that were ostensibly to prohibit sale or resale of the properties to people who were not of German descent. And those covenants just finally got officially tossed. But they were in place, at least on paper, until very, very recently.
Yeah, I was in touch recently with a group in Southbury, Connecticut, who are very, very proud of themselves to this very day, because when the Bund came to set up the youth camp in Southbury, Connecticut, people said no. And they changed the zoning laws overnight as an emergency move. And when the Germans went out there to the land they just bought and started to dig a foundation, they were promptly arrested, and the youth camp was never built. And to this day, they're still having celebrations and the anniversary of the day that the Nazis came and they got the boot. But not in Yaphank. In Yaphank, they took hold. And I had a hard time finding anybody in that town who really wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, it's really, as I said, up until very, very recently, those covenants were still on the books, not enforceable, but still there on the transfers and all of that. It's crazy. Towards the end of your book, you talk about, and I guess this was shortly before Pearl Harbor happened, a rally in Madison Square Garden, which, yes, again, people just can't, I'm sure, wrap their heads around a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. How to come about and talk about it.
Yeah, this is pretty much the last-ditch attempt. Kuhn has traveled the country. He's had his rallies busted up in major cities from coast to coast, in LA, in New York, in Chicago, in the Great Lakes area. Every place he goes, except for Texas, where things were fine. But he's had a lot of problems. So he decides, instead of having little regional rallies, he's going to have one national rally, pro-America, Wake Up America rally in Madison Square Garden. And he's very careful to put his ducks in a row. He gets all of his paperwork set up right. He gets the New York cops to protect him and his people. So there are guards on the outside of the garden, making sure that the enemy doesn't get in. And we don't even know if the gangsters were there, but everybody else was. The place was completely surrounded by protesting groups. Now, this is a good year and a half after the gangsters started punching out Nazis whenever they could find them. And it's become a lot more popular of an idea. England's being bombed. So there are a lot more Americans who are on the gangster side now. And the police are able to keep everybody out except for one unemployed Jewish plumber from the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, who sneaks in, and he waits until Fritz Kuhn's given his speech and he's talking his crapola, and he runs up on the stage, unplugs the microphone, yells into the audience something to the effect of "Hitler has one ball," and is promptly tackled by Kuhn's security guards, and they pull down his pants, which gets a big laugh in the garden. Ha 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 ha! Look at the Jew without his pants, and it's pretty quickly rescued by the NYPD. And there's a picture of him with his pants still down, being carried out by cops, and it looks like the cops are his enemy, but he is now in safe hands. Second, the cops have him, he's fine. Pull up your pants. You have to go to jail. You know that. He says, "Yeah, I know." So he spends the night in jail, and the next morning, the courtroom is packed with Jewish men who want to be the one to pay his bail. And the next day in the newspapers, Fritz Kuhn's dreams of having it be headlines across America about the great German-American Bund rally and the glorious word of Adolf Hitler, it's all about Izzy Greenbaum pulling the plug on him, and he completely stole the show. So Izzy, I got, when I think my book was coming out in about a week or so, and I got a message from Izzy Greenbaum's grandson. So, is my grandfather going to be in your book? I said, "Oh, your grandfather's got his own chapter. He's a hero. And by the way, your grandmother's gorgeous."
It's we're just touching on the story and the content of the book. It really is just an amazing story that again, most of our listeners and just people are not aware of, and how it came about, and the good work that these otherwise questionable types, the gangsters, actually engaged in some public service activity. Again, we're touching
my morality is based on the Dirty Dozen defense,
Exactly.
which is a movie that I think everybody's seen, in which the absolute worst criminals in the brig of the U.S. Army are released as long as they go on a suicide mission to fight Nazis. So
well, again, you know what, you're touching on something. I think one of the instructions I think that they got was you could do whatever you want to them, but don't kill them.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
That's right. And because if you kill them, we lose the moral high ground.
Right.
We're not at war with them. We just want them to shut up. And the war that followed, that was fought with guns. So they armed themselves soon enough.
Again, the book is fascinating. The book is Gangsters versus Nazis. We're just touching on the surface here, in this little discussion, but I'm going to invite everybody. Michael's going to be out at Syosset Library on September 15th for a live presentation. And I know, Mike, you have a really interesting and terrific PowerPoint and great discussion. And it's going to be a wonderful program. So take a look at the book and come on down to the library on the 15th of September, and you can hear from Michael Benson in person. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today, and it was great talking to you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person, and we'll get this up and we'll get people.
Syosset, here I come. See you next month.
We're looking forward to it.
Take care.
So with that, everybody, I will turn the page on this chapter of our podcast.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.